It is Friday the 16th of October 2020, and we're looking at the first of two fairly lengthy web pages that give the full text of my hypothesis to the effect that the mythical phoenix bird, and actually a whole bunch of other mythical birds and bird gods, were inspired by a bird-like pattern in the sun's corona that's seen during some total solar eclipses. I'm not going to go into much more detail about that. I'm just going to start reading what we have here. So, Pedigree of the Phoenix, the total solar eclipse sunbird, part 1. The winged disc, or ring with wings symbol, is found throughout Egypt and what was ancient Mesopotamia. It appears in Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions and on the royal seals and cartouches of pharaohs and Assyrian kings. This ancient religious symbol is carved onto obelisks, the capstones of pyramids, and alabaster bas-reliefs, and is painted onto fading wall murals. It graces the stone lintels of the entrances to a great many temples and palaces in both Egypt and Mesopotamia. Numerous Egyptian pharaohs, as well as Hittite, Akkadian, and Assyrian kings and Persian shahs, employed this ubiquitous symbol as a royal sign of their divinely ordained status. El, the supreme deity of the Canaanites, is portrayed on an eroded stela from Ras Shamra Ugarit, with the winged globe hovering overhead. Just scroll down a little bit. The Assyrian supreme deity Ashur is depicted as a winged archer standing within the solar disk on a wall painting from the 9th century BCE that is now preserved in the British Museum. His bow is drawn and its upper arc blends into the circumference of the flaming solar disk. The ring with wings symbol was later adapted to Zoroastrian usage by the Persian Shahs Darius and Xerxes I, who, between the two of them, ruled over the people of Persia from 521 to 465 BCE. This time, the human figure depicted standing within the winged sun symbol portrayed the Zoroastrian supreme deity Ahura Mazda, their lord of wisdom. This ancient Persian variant of what the prominent turn-of-the-century British astronomer Edward Walter Maunder referred to as the ring with wing symbol is prominently displayed on the remaining stonework of Persepolis and is known today as the Farohar or Farohar symbol. I think it's also known as the Shravashi. So here we have a photograph of the 1991 total solar eclipse. We clearly see the bird-like pattern, and here we have it's kind of like an overlaid image. So this is the Assyrian depiction of Ashur, and then we have overlaid the Persian Farohar symbol with Ahura Mazda in the ring with wings symbol. So this was on the website from 1998 to 2006 when they went down. I have collected considerable evidence which supports the theory that the ancient Egyptian wing solar disk symbol and the analogous Mesopotamian ring with wing symbol were in all probability inspired by ancient observations of total solar eclipses. The diaphanous equatorial streamers of the corona, which are most pronounced during total solar eclipses that occur during years when the sunspot cycle is at its minimum phase of activity, bear a remarkable resemblance to the outspread wings of a glorious celestial bird, while the plume-like polar rays mimic the fanned-out tail feathers of a bird. This wing-like appearance of the equatorial streamers of the sun's outer corona was first remarked upon by professional astronomers in the latter half of the 19th century, and it quickly became fashionable among astronomers to refer to the sun's coronal streamers as wings. The following report of the total solar eclipse of May 28, 1900 by H.C. Wilson, which was published in Popular Astronomy magazine, clearly illustrates this. Up in the heavens, where an instant before had been the brilliant crescent of the sun, hung the black disk of the moon. Around its edge was a narrow but brilliant ring of an indescribably beautiful pearly, silvery, shimmering light. The inner corona, extending out into space on either side of the sun, like the wings of a gigantic bird. Let me read that one more time. Extending out into space on either side of the sun, like the wings of a gigantic bird, were the streamers of the outer corona, less brilliant than the inner ring, but bright and equally beautiful. The light of this outer corona was not uniform but varied in intensity, giving the appearance of structure to it. The writer particularly noticed a leaf-like form in one of the wings, similar to those observed in previous eclipses. The outer corona wings were strikingly similar to the tail of a brilliant comet in appearance, although nothing has yet been observed to indicate that they have the same composition. And they don't. In Scientific American magazine of October 9th, 1886, we read, "The corona extended nearly 2 diameters from the sun and exhibited a feathery structure at the poles. The similarity of the polar rays of the sun's corona to the fanned-out feathers or plumes of a bird's tail, combined with the likeness of the corona's equatorial streamers to the outspread wings of a bird, has inspired many modern astronomers to regularly refer to these structures as plumes. This word plumes is now a perfectly acceptable and virtually universal technical term for these coronal streamers among professional astronomers who observe total solar eclipses. In fact, a contemporary scientific article on the sun's corona, which was published in Scientific American magazine, was titled Sol's Plumage. The remarkable resemblance of the sun's corona to a radiant white bird hovering behind a red-rimmed and blackened lunar disk is genuinely remarkable. It is usually most evident during the minimum phase of sunspot activity. A superb photograph of the June 11, 1991 total solar eclipse that was taken by the French astronomer Serge Couchemy was published in the National Geographic magazine of May 1992. Although this eclipse occurred just after the peak period of sunspot activity, one does not have to use very much of one's imagination to see a prodigious and ethereal white bird of extraordinary beauty. One may easily imagine this bird as a celestial dove or a cosmic swan, hovering behind the black disk of the moon. This gigantic bird, which is readily perceivable in the sun's corona during some total solar eclipses, is extremely impressive in its apparent size, to say nothing of its actual size. I mean, in its actual size, it's millions of miles in size. In terms of its perceived size, from a human being standing on the surface of Earth and looking up, I mean, it's basically, you've got the moon covering the sun, so the body, if you want, is as big as the moon. The wings on either side are at least the same length as the diameter of the moon on either side of it, but they can actually stretch quite a bit further. So if you compare this to an actual bird flying in the sky above you, unless that bird is very close and quite large, this bird seen during the solar eclipse is much, much bigger than your typical bird. It's a gigantic bird compared to other birds that are flying fairly high in the sky, even large ones like an eagle or even a condor. You know, if it's high in the sky, this eclipse bird pattern is going to be bigger than even a condor. The sun's coronal plumes and streamers that constitute the plumage of this celestial bird actually extend for many hundreds of thousands and even millions of miles into the expanse of outer space. Their apparent length to anyone observing a total solar eclipse from the Earth is at least equal to the diameter of the moon. Thus, the full wingspan of this gigantic bird is at least 3 times broader than the disk of the full moon. One evening I observed a large heron flying at a maximum altitude of only a couple of hundred feet up in the sky, and not more than a few hundred feet distant from me where I was watching it. Its size was certainly impressive, clearly much bigger than most of the other birds in the sky, including nearby seagulls, which are by no means small birds. Yet the heron was still quite small in comparison to the looming white circle of the full moon that was rising above the horizon in the eastern sky as the heron flew past. This fairly large bird would in no way compare in size to the tremendous cosmic bird that may be perceived within the sun's coronal halo during a total solar eclipse. No natural earthly bird flying at a reasonable distance from an observer could possibly compare in apparent size with the gigantic celestial bird which may be witnessed during a total solar eclipse, with the possible exception of an extremely large bird, such as a condor, flying within a few hundred feet of the observer. I will say, you know, if you know, even a sparrow flew close to your face, it's going to be bigger. But in terms of normal viewing of birds, you know, we're really talking about what looks to be a very large bird. I think I've already said enough about that, but yeah, obviously a tiny little hummingbird, if it's just a few feet away from you, is going to look somewhat bigger than the total solar eclipse sunbird, as it were. But in terms of what you would normally see in terms of birds flying in the sky, this bird is a lot bigger. There should be very little doubt in modern minds that the enormous cosmic sunbird, whose form is clearly perceivable within the sun's corona, is the source of inspiration for many, if not most, mythical birds. This ethereal apparition was most certainly perceived by the people of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, the ancient Americas, and elsewhere. Not the least of these mythical sunbirds, and the one that is certainly the most familiar to Western people, is the proverbial phoenix. This ubiquitous, legendary bird of the sun was believed to make an appearance every few hundred years or so, only to die immolated in its own flames. It was then reborn from its own ashes, or from an egg-like ball of myrrh. This ancient myth sounds a lot like a total solar eclipse to me. And as I said elsewhere, there's even more detail into the phoenix myth that points towards total solar eclipses, not the least of them being that the time span between the death and rebirth of the phoenix, the day on which the phoenix died and was reborn, some of the time spans given in the different versions of the myth are solar cycles. So it's clearly the sun, or a form of the sun. If the years given between the death and rebirth of the phoenix are measured in solar cycles, numbers that are associated with the sun. In sun worship in ancient India by V.C. Srivastava of the Department of Ancient History, Culture and Archaeology of the University of Allahabad, we are informed that the concept of a solar bird had been quite prominent among many ancient civilizations. Among the Egyptians, the falcon was the sacred bird of the sun god. That's Horus. In Babylonia, too, a bird represented the sun god. Among the Greeks, Apollo and the sun god had the swan as sacred too. So here we have a swan being closely associated with Apollo. And yes, the white bird of the sun looks a lot like a swan. Or other large white birds, such as an ibis, which will bring us to Thoth, or Toth, however you want to pronounce it. So where are we here? Yeah, so in Vedic literature, there are many references to the sunbird. Garuda became the classic sunbird of India. There are representations of an eagle or a falcon in the Indus seals and pottery. On Cemetery H pottery too, we find birds in association with the rayed orbs of the sun. It may be suggested that the eagle or falcon of the proto-historic India foreshadows the tradition of the sunbird of later times. The rays of the sun have been glorified several times in Vedic literature. The solar rays can rightly be described as the golden bird, and it is therefore not surprising that Vishnu may have been closely associated with the sunbird Garuda. It is significant to note that Surya has been identified with the bird Garuda as early as the Rig Veda. Sometimes it is simply called the Suparna, which may mean a beautiful feathered bird, as well as the beautiful rays of the sun. So let's keep going. Still got some time. Scroll up. The fact that this solar bird was often closely associated with rayed orbs of the sun tends to underscore the fact that it was most probably inspired by the bird-like pattern which may be perceived in the sun's corona, since the rayed symbol was in fact inspired by the rays of the sun's corona, which only become visible during total solar eclipses. Our ancient ancestors created rich mythologies as well as intricate theological concepts and religious iconography about these sunbirds. Elmer G. Surr, in his regrettably now out of print book on eclipse lore, The Mask, the Unicorn, and the Messiah, clearly recognized that total solar eclipses were the awe-inspiring celestial phenomenon that in all probability originally inspired not only the phoenixes of both the ancient Middle East and the Orient, but also the Garuda sunbird of Indian religion and other mythical sunbirds. There was perhaps no astronomical phenomena more startling to primitive and early civilized man than the total solar eclipse. Without any warning, by way of sound or sight, he noticed an eerie and untimely darkness settling over the land, and when he looked at the sun, he saw a menacingly dark circle covering the bright central area of light. From the edge of the darkness, a desperate flare of shooting light heightened the dramatic effect of the experience, a flare which tended to take on a feathery texture, so much more spectacular in contrast to the dark center. In an annular eclipse, the light takes on the form of a bright ring. Since the flare of the total solar eclipse frequently reaches out further on two opposite sides, the Assyrians and Egyptians pictured this effect as the wings of a mighty bird. The Chinese also developed the bird with outstretched wings in their image of the sun. Then followed the creation of the phoenix, the Garuda of India, and fanciful birds to represent the sun itself. And well, we still got 4 minutes left, so let's keep going. Whoops-a-daisy. Where are we? I lost. One of the primary religious symbols of the ancient Egyptians was a red sun disk. It represented the various Egyptian sun gods, including Ra. This sun disk was usually encircled by or rimmed on either side by the Aret serpent, also known as the Urius or fiery cobra. The Urius cobra was often depicted with a sun disk perched on its rearing head to emphasize its association with the sun. I will just interject that just yesterday I was looking at a winged Urius symbol, a very nice one, I will add. So even the winged serpent concept is a variation on the same theme. We'll get to that later, but essentially the winged serpent, also known as the dragon, is essentially inspired by exactly the same phenomena, just a different interpretation of it. So the sun's chromosphere could easily be perceived as a cosmic serpent encircling the sun, with the flaming red solar prominences appearing to the ancient Egyptians to be the rearing heads of flame-spitting cobras. When elongated vulturings inspired by the equatorial streamers of the corona were added to the solar disk stretching out on one or both sides, the sun disk became the wing disk. According to the book The Migration of Symbols by Comte Eugene Goblet d'Alviela, it has been said, with good reason, that the winged globe is the Egyptian symbol par excellence. According to an inscription at Edfu, it was Thoth himself who caused it to be placed above the entrances to all the temples in order to commemorate the victory won by Horus over Set, i.e. the principle of light and good over that of darkness and evil. Well, you'll never guess where that principle came from. It came from, obviously, seeing the moon completely obliterate the sun during a total solar eclipse, and then this bird appears. So not just the phoenix, but Horus, same thing, essentially, just a different variation on the different interpretation of the theme, is essentially what it comes down to. So Horus, easily provable to be God inspired by this bird-like pattern. So here's the Egyptian winged sun. Here's a few others. I think we're getting close to the end here. 1 minute 22 seconds. I don't want to run out of time. As I've stated, a very similar symbol known as the Farohar, aka Faravahar, was used by various ancient Mesopotamian cultures to represent their supreme sky gods. As Theophilus Pinches wrote in his The Religion of Babylonian Assyria in 1906, in consequence of its general appearance, the image of the god has been likened to the sun in eclipse, the far-stretching wings being thought to resemble the long streamers visible at the moment of totality, and it must be admitted as probable that this may have given the idea of the symbol shown on the sculptures. I think we'll end on that note and we'll start a new clip. So I'm not the first or only person to be saying this, and people were saying it more than a century ago. Yeah, so that's that. We're wrapping this up.